Hey guys, Mark Allen, BHSpringSolutions LLC and BHSpringSolutions.com. In this session, we are going to start with a very classic high power. This would be, based on the serial number, we believe it to be one of the first 7,500 high powers ever made. Of course, in Belgium, it looks like it wound up in Argentina at one point. And we're going to go through this. This is one of the original, internal extractor models. We'll be talking about that to a great extent as well. The first thing we want to focus on with the high power pistol is something that made the high power pistol somewhat revolutionary. It was the first very popular pistol with a double stack magazine. Some people call it a stagger stack. There was actually another pistol before the high power that used they called it a stagger stack magazine. The high powers was called a double stack, and I don't know if there's a difference between those two, but in any event, the high power was very revolutionary because of its capacity. And we want to focus first and foremost on the magazine. That's a component that's really universal among all of the high power models, pretty much. Most are interchangeable one to another and generation to generation, but this is an original schematic from FN in Urstal, Belgium. And I want to focus in on the magazine. This is all about functionality, and we're going to start kind of very much from the beginning. And I want to show you, we're going to come right back to this poster, but I want to show you here in real life in a high power. You know, when you put that magazine in, this does have a round in the magazine, nothing in the chamber. And you get to about this point, and you have to give it that extra little bit of an oomph of a push, and then you lock in place. But there's this resistance at the end of the magazine insertion. That resistance is right here. You're going to see the bottom of the slide, which is right along that line, is running right along alongside the top of the bullet casing, and it looks like they're actually in contact with each other, and they are, and that's part of the design. So when you are giving that magazine its last little bit of push, you're actually pushing that top bullet against this area of the slide. So, okay, we've changed positions here to see if we can get a little less glare on the picture. What we were explaining is that last little bit of push that it takes you to insert your high power magazine, especially if you have a completely full magazine, and especially if that last round is very, very tight, you're going to find a little extra push because you're having to actually push down that top cartridge until this part of the slide recoils back past the back of the cartridge. This is why short cycling is such a topic. If you overspring a high power and this part right here fails to get behind the next round and allow this next round to pop up in the magazine and present properly, then you can short cycle. Some of the things that you notice in this, the magazine was really, it's a work of art. The magazine follower, the follower itself is angled with the angles of the magazine. It's made for extremely smooth function and operation, even with the double stack feature. Another thing I wanted to point out here, this is always of some interest to folks. This really shows you exactly the layout of the magazine disconnect device. And we'll talk more in depth about that, but if everything on this, most everything looks very symmetrical, but then you get to these opposing angles of the magazine disconnect and the magazine, the face of the magazine, and you start to get the idea that that was an afterthought and done after the fact. To Dieudonné saves credit, considering that this device and its interaction with the trigger and the trigger lever and the positioning of the trigger lever, considering that was not part of the original plan, the fact that he did that and made it work is actually quite a genius thing, although it's not desirable by many people. it is quite a feat of engineering when you look at this and how he did it. And again, we'll talk more in depth about this in a later session. In this first generation high power, we inherited a magazine. They used to serialize even the magazines back in the day, and they had a metal follower. The Inglis's and the Ishapurs, it's like a hunk of lead. It's even bigger, a bigger follower than this one. And when you first take a look at this, one of the things you might notice is it looks like that follower looks cockeyed. Now you got to remember that this thing has probably got 80 years on it, 75 years-ish on this actual magazine. But what I wanted to show you here, first off, is the importance of gauging this angle of presentation of the cartridge. And BHSpringSolutions has a magazine angle gauge cartridge presentation tool. And what we want to see is this surface of the cartridge to be parallel with this edge of the gauge tool. And of course, this old magazine, it's past its useful life, and you can see based on this that the bullet head is in contact with the gauge. The back of the bullet is not. The cartridge is presenting much too high in the front. What that should look like, and this is a newer Metgar magazine, what this should look like is more like that, if we can zoom in on it, or if we can see that in the camera. And we have this nice parallel line between the gauge tool and the cartridge. That's one of the first Achilles heels of the high power. I'm going to show you something else. This is a modern Metgar magazine. As far as I'm concerned, they're the best that's ever been made for the high power. Do you see the original back of this high power magazine? We've actually got the primer exposed, and that's kind of a no-no. But also the way that the magazine was originally designed, you've got this area right here that is not in the modern Metgar magazines. Also, the primer is not exposed in the magazine either. And this was changed over the years. The original design had even more of a tendency for the feed lips, and those are the part of the magazine right here, to start to weaken and start to spread. And one of the big reasons the older magazines, the feed lips, would weaken and spread is because this missing metal allows that to happen. It makes it much easier for that metal to weaken and fatigue because there's just not much, there's not as much holding it. So this is one thing that over the years got better and better, was magazine technology. And for today's older high powers, we just consider the old magazines a necessary replacement item for a modern magazine. The modern magazines, they do have a plastic follower. In my opinion, it's more, it's just a smoother extraction of the round. When the slide comes forward and strips that round out of the magazine, it's a smoother action than a metal on metal relationship. It's a better idea. Not exposing the primer is a better idea. Keeping the metal level across the back of the magazine to support the feed lips is a better idea. So anyway, we've spent enough time on that, but we wanted to show you that because that's very important. A magazine, you can even see the major difference between those two. A magazine that is presenting this way can cause you malfunctions in terms of failure to extract and failure to feed, just because this angle can run interference when you're functioning. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get to this high power pistol. With the traditional operating system, we're going to kind of start from square one. With a traditional operating system, in order to take down the high power pistol, you want to lock the slide back with the safety, lift up on the slide stop, and we're going to press it out from right to left, just like that. And then after we have done that, we'll go ahead and slide the slide right off of the frame. Then when the slide's off of the frame, we can go ahead and take out the recoil spring guide rod and the recoil spring and the barrel, and we've done the field strip. We'll go ahead and take the slide apart completely here in just a few minutes. The original high power had a humped feed ramp that persisted until somewhere in the very late 1980s, and it was a fine barrel for round-nosed ammunition. It was blamed, so to say, for not being as good at feeding blunt-nosed ammunition. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, exactly what's going on there. Blunt-nosed ammunition, we see a lot of blunt-nosed ammunition today with a longer bullet profile, and it matters when that bullet comes in contact, first contact with the feed ramp. The humped style was not, in all reality, so much the issue as the location of the initial contact point of the feed ramp in the high power. And I'll show you what I'm talking about here. This Generation 1 frame, this is the position that your barrel is in when your slide is installed and it's getting ready to feed around. This is the position that the barrel is in. And what this humped feed ramp, one of the things that humped feed ramp did is it got the feed ramp ahead of these two edges of the frame area, here and here. Now, in the later generations, and I'm going to grab a 2003 cast frame, and I want to show you just the difference that FN made in this one part over the years. You see this edge, if we can zoom in on that, this edge has been relieved back pretty good amount. This edge right here is a big change if you take a look at that. If we can see it in the camera, you see how much less metal there is right here. The answer to what we call the humped feed ramp barrel was to throat the feed ramp, it's called, or basically flatten the barrel. I'm going to show you the difference in the two right here. You see we have this arc on this feed ramp and we have the straightness on the bottom barrel. Now, our contention is this was not so much about arced or straight or curved or humped or straight as much as it was the initial contact point of the barrel. Now, when we have a throated barrel with a straightened feed ramp, what we have done is we have delayed the initial contact point for these longer bullet profiles. But here's what happened. In the later years, you remember, we see this all gone away because now with a throated barrel, we actually have frame in the way of the feed ramp, or frame just ahead of the feed ramp, and it's the same way on the other side. This metal had to go away when the initial contact point of the feed ramp was moved forward to accommodate these longer bullet profiles. And that's why we see in the later years. Also, today, when someone with a classic high power like this one, they can use a BHSpringSolutions advanced barrel for high powers. However, you're going to need to approximately duplicate the relieving of this metal. And I'm no fan of removing any metal from frames and slides unless it's absolutely necessary, like if you're dovetailing sights in order for a superior sight upgrade to be installed. But this is one where if you want modern ability to feed blunt-nosed ammunition or hollow points, you need a straight feed ramp, and you need to mimic the later effort that FN did to relieve this edge back so it's not out ahead of the initial contact point of the feed ramp, and it needs to be done on both sides. So this barrel that looks like this. In the later version, we see with that relieved area here, we don't have frame out in front of feed ramp. So that's what that is all about, and how that changed over the years in order to accommodate the more modern ammunition. Interesting thing that we find here in this schematic is this is the original recoil spring guide rod. This is one of the areas that it appeared FN attempted to simplify the manufacture. The original guide rod has what looks like a set screw in the end of it. It's not the one that most of us know, where you have this ball bearing in the end of it. You have a set screw in the other end. It's identical. You've got the we call the command and control of your slide stop positioning part of the where the detent ball is in the slide stop. So that didn't change, but the original design was like this. It appears that the spring was captured and then this edge was rolled over that set screw. So this set screw cannot actually be taken out of the guide rod. It will turn down in there about a turn and a half, and then it won't turn anymore. But that's the original guide rod, and a truly complex recoil spring guide rod to make in this particular configuration. The spring inside is still not replaceable. That was kind of the downside of the original ones. The modern day recoil spring guide rod for high power has a ball bearing in both ends, a spring in the middle, still not replaceable. It's two pieces fused together, but less expensive. You don't have to thread the inside of this to screw in a set screw and then roll the end, and then back your set screw out. That was quite a feat of this original recoil spring guide rod, but the replacement for the original, it works as well as the original, and it does the same thing. They didn't sacrifice anything. They did get a less expensive to produce part out of that, however. One thing here in the very, very beginning we want to show you, since we've got a couple of slides here handy. When we talk about drop safety sear lever or the Type 2 sear lever, these two slides demonstrate that very well, and here's how you tell which is which. And it's this part right here in this channel. This is the original. We call this a floating sear lever. It's a straight bar. Then we have the drop safety type sear lever, has a spring underneath this part of the sear lever right here, and it's a different shaped part. I'm going to show you a couple of these outside of the actual packaging. That's what that part looks like, or looked like originally. We call that a Type 1 sear lever, and then it was redesigned in the 80s and became part of the Mark III or Mark III's model, and that sear lever was changed to look like that. So it's the same part, but this area right here, which is a block for the firing pin, was added. So if you have a high power model that has the Type 2 sear lever, you have a Mark III or Mark III's model. So that's what a Type 1 sear lever is. And of course, this one being one of the first ones made, that is also what it has. We're going to take a chance here real quickly and take this internal extractor slide apart. But I wanted to point out to you one thing, and that is right here. We have this sear pin that seats into the slide here, and it's serrated. And when you start thinking about the difficulty of this and in manufacturing, every one of those serrations has to line up. And this is like 1935 when this started. Every one of those serrations need to line up. That sear pin ideally should sit flush. You'll see this one here does not quite sit flush. They were a little notorious for that. And this admittedly was a little bit of an eyesore. It was a tough point for manufacturing. It was just kind of a tough thing. So when we go ahead and take these internal extractor models apart, we take them apart kind of in this order. This is the retaining plate removal tool and installation tool for high powers. You can do this with a pin punch. It's much safer with this tool, as you're going to see just that quickly. Here's our firing pin retaining plate, firing pin spring. Once that is out, what you're going to encounter is basically a 1911 extractor, and there's a place right here. You can get right under it, just like that. It's not difficult. And right out comes our internal extractor. And then from that point, our sear pin comes out, our sear lever is out, and that slide is as stripped as you can get it unless you want to take the sights out of it. For comparison purposes, I have a 1911 extractor and I have Dieudonné Save's internal extractor, and you can see the similarities between these two parts. And it was a good thing for Dieudonné Save that the high power, or the 1911's patents had run out when he started finishing this part. But the Dieudonné Save did some things with this part for the high power differently than John Browning did, and made a lot of sense. One of the things that you'll notice about we have 1911 slide here, high power slide here, and notice the placement of where these two extractors enter at the back of the slide. John Browning made this a very straightforward approach. The center of the extractor hole is below the center of the firing pin hole, and when you look at it from this perspective, it's the same. It's the center of where the extractor comes out in the slide, again, is just below the firing pin hole. In the high power, you start rather high on the slide here, and you come out in about the same place. So it's going in at an angle, starting out here, and then it's actually drilled to go in at an angle. And then you see on John Browning's 1911, his extractor is just very straight across. It's a very straight approach into the slide. Dieudonné Save's extractor in the high power actually is angled, and that angle compensates for the angle that it goes into the slide. Dieudonné Save did some, in my opinion, some truly excellent improvements, I think, on even the 1911 extractor. And one example is, if you can see the size of the extractor claw of the high power extractor claw and the 1911's extractor claw, it is larger, and the 1911's extractor claw measures about 144 thousandths, and Dieudonné Save's high power extractor claw comes in at 157 thousandths. So he went larger on the extractor claw. I have an external extractor from Browning, and the extractor claw, when they went to the external extractor, which we'll be getting to, it's only 112 thousandths. So they reduced the size of the holding or the engaging surface of the extractor when they went to the external extractor. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but it's interesting the changes that he made and that he went larger on the extractor claw. I think that is one of the contributors that gave the high power just this stone cold Browning-esque kind of reliability. I want to show you something else that Diodone Save did differently too. And we notice some of these things in our service center when we're working with these old parts and these old extractors, because actually these high power extractors seem to have a very, very long life. The internal extractors do. But I want to show you what Diodone Save did right here. He angled this end of this extractor claw where it goes over the cartridge casing. He angled it much more where it will be easier for the head of the extractor to come in and go lap up over the edge of the cartridge casing. And the 1911 extractor, again, it's just a very, very straightforward approach. It's beveled here on the end to give it some advantage going over. Diodone Save, it looked like he really wanted to give this high power extractor an easy trip over the edge of the rim of the casing. He also did something else, and that is, for all practical purposes, this arm of this extractor, of this 1911 extractor part, is, you couldn't really call this a spring. On Diodone Save's internal extractor, you see how much thinner that metal is, and this does qualify as a spring. And this metal does actually have some give to it. On the 1911, forget it. To give you an idea of the difference in these, in this area of the part, the 1911 is about 74 thousandths, and the high power internal extractor is only 45 thousandths. So that was another change that he made, and from what we have seen, both of these things create really good longevity of these parts. And to the best of our knowledge, you know, this extractor has been in this high power since you probably would date back to around 1940. In this time frame. So this is one of the things that Diodone Save did, and it seemed like, you know, he really kind of knocked it out of the park with this extractor. Now, having said that, another thing that Diodone Save did as well, I want you to take a look at the 1911 real quickly from this perspective. And you see the closeness of the proximity of the extractor cavity and the firing pin cavity. And Diodone Save did a nice job of buying the tooling department a little margin on those two cavities in the slide, and probably was a betterment, if you will, on the high power slide in that perspective. Now you'll notice a big difference here in the side of the slide. The 1911 here is very, very clean. The high power slide, it gets complicated. You've got this sear lever pin that looks like this with the internal extractors. It has to seat in there like that. Sometimes they didn't sit perfectly flush. They could have. But they didn't, like this one here didn't. John Browning made this slide a much simpler affair to machine. One of the things that Diodone Save did differently than the 1911, we can demonstrate that fairly easily right here. The 1911's trigger pull amounts to about that much take up, and then the next thing that happens is the trigger break, which can happen without the slide on the pistol, and as you see, and the trigger connects directly to the fire control group in the rear of the frame. The 1911 frame is kind of where all of the anything that got complicated at all about the 1911 all happens in the grip frame, and this trigger just connects directly by a bar on both sides of the grip frame that goes back and moves the sear and allows the hammer to come forward. It's a very direct kind of a system, and the High Powers grip frame did not lend itself to that same sort of an approach, because of the double stack magazine. You already have a wide grip frame, already it is for the hand to wrap around, and my theory is he just didn't want to start adding more into the grip frame down the sides and have to thicken the grip frame anymore, possibly. So with the High Power, you can't activate this hammer back here with the trigger with the slide off of the pistol. Instead, you have a trigger lever that comes up, and then it has to activate it goes from the trigger up into the slide and hits the sear lever. The sear lever contacts the sear and trips or allows the hammer to go forward. So it's a much more indirect approach. And one of the things that we notice about the High Power slide is this is a very complex slide assembly to manufacture. The internal extractor part is a rather complex part. It makes this slide a very complex slide to make. An interesting thing about this original High Power pistol does not contain one single roll pin anywhere. And many of your Mark III era pistols were made, and there's 5 roll pins. And but at the time that this was made, rather than have a sear lever pin that's a roll pin, it involved this kind of a part, and then your recesses and cutouts in the slide to accommodate the part. That was later simplified and would have helped FN have this not be such a complex pistol to manufacture, and some of the parts also not so complex. So we're going to leave it there for this time. Thanks for joining us for this session. I'm Mark Allen, BH Spring Solutions LLC and BHSpringSolutions.com.